Hello, everybody. My name is Phil Schwan. I'm a solutions architect with Netrix, and we're going to be taking a look today at the Windows 10 Cloud Managed Desktop and Modern Management. Just a few quick housekeeping notes. The session obviously is being recorded. I'm flying solo today, so if you do have questions throughout the presentation, we'll have some time, hopefully at the end, to answer those questions. So if you don't mind just going ahead and typing those questions in the chat window as we go, and if you do, if you could please put a little context around the questions, because again, I probably won't see those questions until the end. So if you say, what exactly do you mean by that? I may not know what you're referring to. So please put a little context around the questions, and then we'll try to get them addressed at the end of the presentation. So as I said, my name is Phil Schwan from Netrix. Netrix is a nationally managed Microsoft partner. We focus across several stacks, not only Microsoft, but a lot of cloud stacks, a lot of other practices outside of just Microsoft products. But the team that I'm on is specifically the enterprise computing and mobility team, and we focus very heavily on endpoint management and focusing on the end user. So we have a very robust practice around Windows 10, everything from Windows 10 deployments, System Center Configuration Manager, application deployment and packaging, everything around that end. So anything basically having to do with the endpoint or managing the end user computing environment, that's where our practice's focus is on. So from an agenda standpoint, we're just going to kind of break this down real quickly into why we're looking at doing a cloud managed desktop, what the specific scenario is that would drive that sort of management paradigm. What more generally is modern management with Windows 10, and what are the components that make that up? And then we'll dive into some demos and take a look hands-on at what that looks like, and then we'll circle back just to touch briefly on how we would get there from where we are today. So why would we look at a cloud managed desktop? Well, as an IT professional who's been working especially in the desktop administration area for a long time, one of the scenarios that keeps coming up is that mobile information worker scenario. That scenario where we have an information worker that is out in the field almost continually. So we have to get a machine for them, get it provisioned, try to determine how much we can lock it down versus how much we can actually manage it when it's off the network. And then basically watch as they take it out into the world, into the wild, wild west, and very rarely ever come back on our local network. So they're never in the office, and traditionally, at least early on, we were always relying upon them having to maintain a VPN connection back into the office to do anything, whether it's to apply group policies, to change their password, to do any sort of management at all of that machine. We were wholly reliant on the end user to initiate VPN connections, and then trust that they would keep it on long enough for us to actually be able to do anything. And on top of that, of course, it's not a very bandwidth friendly connection typically. So there's only so much that we're able to do across that VPN tunnel. What that ended up leaving as well is little to no visibility for the system in terms of what its current state is, any sort of inventory, or really any peace of mind that there was stability for that system going forward, both stability and security. Where this was early on very much a fringe type of scenario where you might just have some mobile salespeople. At this point, this scenario is increasingly becoming the norm. We're seeing a lot more focus around mobility and a lot more focus around end users wanting to be able to sort of blend the work and the personal, being able to access their information and do their work on a multitude of devices and platforms. And as IT, we need to be able to manage that and ensure that they have the flexibility to be productive while we have the security and knowing that the identity and the data ultimately is protected. The traditional path for handling these types of scenarios right now, if you're using Configuration Manager, you still typically will have a domain join machine, and the bulk of the security management around that is still going to be with group policy. Configuration manager, if you're using client settings or using agent things that are delivered by the agent, you do a lot of manipulation of local group policy through that, but you're still relying on a connection back internally somehow to get those policies applied to that machine. So one of the recent advancements in the Config Manager product to help with that is what they call the Cloud Management Gateway. So for internet-based client management, traditionally IBCM involved standing up separate server infrastructure within the DMZ and having to open firewall ports and manage that, deal with certificates from a PKI, and make sure that you could get internet-based clients passing that information through in a DMZ type scenario. It was very cumbersome. It wasn't fun to set up or to administer. And so with the increasing ties to the Azure platform, the Config Manager product now allows what's called the Cloud Management Gateway. So it's basically automatically spinning up an A2 virtual machine in Azure, and that acts as sort of your management, just as it says, a management gateway for clients to connect back through to the internal infrastructure, rather than having to put that in a DMZ for that connectivity. So it's a great advancement. It's much easier to manage, but there are still some drawbacks to it. So in this scenario, you still have a group policy dependency for a lot of your security, and that means ultimately they're still going to have to connect back to your domain controller. There are some advancements going through with the newer always-on VPN. One of the previous recommendations for this was around setting up something like direct access. But you're still relying ultimately on connectivity in some form or fashion back to your internal network. For something like a cloud management gateway and a cloud distribution point where you're hosting your content, your applications for those internet-based clients, you're still going to have hosting costs. You're still going to have virtual machines and Azure storage that you're going to have to pay for, and network connectivity that you're going to have to pay for. And in the current iteration, the systems must still start on premise. So your config manager based systems must start on premise as intranet connected and then roam out to internet. And even if they stay internet from that point on, there's still that need to roam them out to that. There are some advancements that are allowing that to not be the case in the near future, but currently that's the way that has to be set up. So there are a lot of caveats to getting that. And while it's still a little more flexible for internet-based clients, you still have a lot of internal dependencies around that. Going down an additional path is the hybrid path. So there, for a long time, there was that determination of, do we go, when we're using Intune for mobile device management, do we go the quote-unquote hybrid path and integrate it with Configuration Manager, or do we do a standalone path and just have it completely separate and two completely separate management platforms and interfaces? And so what happens is you would need to determine that management authority early on, and then the process, if you ever needed to change that, became very cumbersome. Initially, it involved a call to Microsoft support, and upwards of 2 weeks for that to happen. And that support time has been reduced, but still there's the concern over having to re-enroll clients, replicate your policies and everything, and from Config Manager into the Intune standalone console or vice versa. And it was a very cumbersome process. More recently, that's been changed with the advent of co-management and the ability to more seamlessly migrate those from a Config Manager and Intune hybrid scenario into the more traditional standalone with the Azure portal. But one of the advantages that was originally looked at was that whole single pane of glass, and we can administer our mobile devices and our traditional devices all from within that single console. But looking at some of the drawbacks around this approach, on the Config Manager side, they've moved to a servicing model, which allows them to continuously introduce new features and new functionalities into the product on a regular basis. But at the end of the day, it's still a slower release cadence in Config Manager than it is natively within the Intune portal. So an example would be IPsec for Cisco VPN connections. That was introduced very early on into the Intune standalone platform, but it took a while until that was available in the config manager platform. And even now, there are still some limitations around that. So, for example, I just talked with a customer yesterday where for integration with a third party, they needed to be able to supply a custom name for or subject name for the SCEP certificate, which can easily be done in the Intune Azure portal, but can't be done in the Config Manager portal, even though the same basic functionality and support for IPsec VPN is already there. So it kind of gives an example of how the features and functionality still are at a slower release cadence in the Config Manager product versus the Intune standalone, and it's just the nature of the platform. And in addition to that, as the mobility and the identity features are broadened on the Azure side, a lot of those things that are tied in aren't necessarily within the Intune product itself, and so they're not readily available to be administered from within the Config Manager portal. So a good example would be the mobile application management policies. You can create application enrollment based policies from the console, but the MAM without enrollment policies, for example, weren't available to be administered from within the config manager console. So now you're already looking at certain functionalities requiring the config manager or the Azure portal for administration. So now the whole single pane of glass notion is kind of shattered. So looking at the more modern management path, which is the future-looking direction, we're looking at more integration with Azure Active Directory and using Intune as the management platform. So the paradigm becomes more identity-based instead of device-based. So rather than looking at strictly managing the device and hoping to keep that perimeter around the device from a security standpoint, we're looking to base everything off of the actual user identity and the data that's being accessed by those users. So not everything then becomes platform-based. It's more about being service-based and being able to simply require certain security requirement or security features be met before we can grant access to that. In terms of imaging, there's a big shift then around imaging machines. So traditionally, imaging has always been taking an operating system that may have come on the device, wiping it clean, and then laying down a fresh copy of an operating system with whatever tweaks and configurations that we want for that operating system. Now, because Windows 10 from an operating system standpoint is the same across the board, regardless of which SKU you're using, when you look at Pro versus Enterprise and so forth, we want to simply be able to reprovision that in place rather than the inefficiency of taking, 3, 4, 5 gigs of operating system off a disk only to lay the exact same thing back down, plus a little bit extra. Let's just reprovision that in place and reconfigure it to bring it in line with the security standards that we need. From a modern management standpoint, because we're relying inherently on cloud-based services to do the management rather than services that are maintained within our own infrastructure, we no longer have that requirement for it to be on-prem. We can actually do things without them ever physically touching our network to begin with, or logically touching our network to begin with. And as I mentioned earlier, ultimately this is all predicated around and designed around that mobility and that user experience. So let's take a look at some of the specifics as to how all of this works. So from a feature standpoint, when we look at management of these devices, we're looking at, first and foremost, leveraging Azure Active Directory as the primary management platform. So we're going to rely on that directory service rather than the traditional on-prem Active Directory service to be able to handle authentication and any of the other security features that we want to. What that allows us to do then is to have direct security integration with things like conditional access and multi-factor authentication. So at any point that a directory service or an Azure service is invoked or required, those things will be in play and can be leveraged to ensure that there's some sort of security and stability for that system, and that the identity and the integrity of the user is intact for that access. It also allows us multiple onboarding methods. So whereas traditionally we rely on doing everything at the outset of the imaging of that computer, everything from domain join and configuration across the board for that device. Now we have multiple options that we can leverage to do this. So to join Azure Active Directory, I can do that as part of my provisioning process. Uh, Using the out-of-box experience wizard during Windows setup to initiate that Azure Active Directory domain join, or I can go back after the fact. If I have a system that's already up and running, a user has already been logged into it, it already may have some things that we want to maintain on that system, but we want to bring it in to join it to Azure Active Directory. I can do it after the fact, much the same as I would a traditional on-prem Active Directory domain join, but it can be done from pretty much anywhere in the world. Once that machine is authenticated and registered into Azure Active Directory, I can then have it automatically do enrollment into Intune. So rather than relying on the user to initiate the installation or onboarding into my management platform, I can have that happen automatically. So if you're coming from a traditional config manager background, you're familiar with client push installation, which sits there and basically as soon as a machine is discovered, it attempts to automatically put that config manager client on the machine so that it can be managed. In this case, as soon as a machine is Azure Active Directory domain joined, it automatically gets enrolled in Intune and is then subject to our Intune policies and configurations. From an information protection standpoint, then we can begin to leverage the policies within Intune to manage things such as BitLocker. So we can enforce BitLocker encryption on the machine and set the encryption level, encryption algorithms, encryption policies that we want in place for that machine. We can also manage things like Windows Information Protection, which was formerly known as Enterprise Data Protection. And what that basically provides is if you're familiar with the mobile device management side, it provides that mobile application management type of control around Windows-based applications. So, for example, applying protection to Outlook. So a user has a corporate email profile within Outlook, and we don't want them to be able to copy information out of Outlook into non-managed applications or save attachments from their Outlook into non-managed locations outside of something like OneDrive. We can set those policies to put those in place to protect the integrity of the data within those applications based on the user's identity. Additionally, we can leverage, again, things like conditional access to ensure that certain requirements, certain security requirements are put in place and are compliant before we allow them to access corporate resources through Azure-based services. From an update management standpoint, we can manage policies around Windows Update for Business, so we can put in place policies to determine how quickly after a new Windows feature release the user will be presented with that feature or those quality updates. So we can set deferment windows in place so that they don't necessarily get them right away. We're relying in that situation on Microsoft to set the time at which they're available, but we then defer it from that time forward. So and the content itself is being pulled down from Microsoft servers rather than having to host that content on distribution points internally or on cloud-based distribution points externally. From an application delivery standpoint, so we can use some direct integration with Office 365 and be able to deliver the O365 click to run to the clients very quickly. We can also manage store-based applications, universal Windows applications, whether they be freely available apps or bulk purchased licensed applications through the Windows Store for Business. And then using upcoming technology known as Sidecar, we can begin to deliver not only basic MSIs, which are already available through the MDM channel, but also more complex MSIs and executables and even PowerShell scripts down to those machines for management. On the system security side, we can manage the Windows Hello settings and in fact invoke those right from onboarding of the machine. We can also ensure system security through Windows, the built-in Windows Defender, and then additionally add the advanced threat protection features on to Windows Defender to ensure that we have cloud-based system security integrated right into the operating system. And then from a user experience standpoint, we can then also enable enterprise state roaming to ensure that a user's user experience at the desktop level roams with them from machine to machine and is also resilient, so that in the event that they need to swap into a different machine and onboard a different machine, their settings will roam right over to that new machine seamlessly. So just to dive into a few quick differences here, there is a fundamental difference between the Azure Active Directory device registration, which is traditionally termed a workplace join, versus the actual Azure AD domain join. And I won't go too deeply into this other than to say that the workplace join is designed to maintain that traditional Active Directory management and using local group policy or using group policy, but provides some additional integrations into the Azure-based services, so enabling single sign-on for company-based cloud apps, for example. Whereas Azure AD domain join is more required for leveraging some of the advanced modern management features. So in that instance, you're actually logging in with an Azure AD account versus a local Active Directory account that just happens to be synced with Azure Active Directory. But then it gives you those additional features like the enterprise state roaming we just talked about, the ability to store our BitLocker key against that Azure Active Directory account so that it can be retrieved later by the user themselves, things like that. This next slide actually has quite a bit more information that I'm not going to go through line by line, but you can see that there's a difference between the features and functionality and the paradigm between Azure Active Directory based machine management versus traditional domain-based management with device registration in Azure Active Directory. An additional feature that was recently released and is expanding is the Autopilot feature. So Autopilot allows you to predefine or pre-identify corporate-owned assets for Windows 10 from within that cloud surface. And it's very analogous to the device enrollment program for Apple, where you would pre-register corporate-owned devices, and then when those devices came online, there was an automatic experience and registration process that was tied to those devices. In this case, it's very much leveraging the same type of functionality in that you generate a hardware ID, and that hardware ID is uploaded to the Azure service. To start with, it's in the Microsoft Store for Business, but that functionality is also being ported over into the Azure portal on the Intune side so that it can be managed from there as well. That information can either be generated by a script and uploaded by you as an IT person into your Autopilot configuration, or going forward, the intent is to actually have hardware vendors and OEMs be able to auto-generate that information and upload it directly into your instance of that service. Where this comes into play is quite often when you would order machines from a hardware vendor or from an OEM, you don't necessarily all depot all of those machines. They don't necessarily all come into a single central location. A lot of times they'll be drop shipped to a remote location or even drop shipped directly to users. And typically your OEM or your vendor is going to provide you with some of the hardware information ahead of time. They're going to send you a spreadsheet or some other manifest as to what the the serial numbers and everything else were for those hardware devices. So in this case, it's just that ability to extend that and allow the hardware vendors or the OEMs to upload that information into that instance. And then in the scenario that we're talking about with the information worker, we can actually then have those machines directly shipped to the end user out in the field, rather than having to have them come into IT first for provisioning. So we can send them to them. The machine info is already loaded into Autopilot, and then that will in turn affect the experience, which we'll see here shortly, that they get when they run through the out-of-box experience wizard for those machines. So let's dive into some demos, take a look at what some of this looks like. And we'll start on the Intune side. So we've talked a lot about policy and how we can go through and manage a lot of these things. Let's take a look at where some of these policies live from within Intune and what our options are. So starting with device enrollment, this is where we'll actually get a chance to see the where the autopilot pieces have been pulled over into Intune. So if we go and we look in, we'll see this Windows Autopilot deployment preview that's currently in here. Now these same things can also be managed in the Microsoft Store for Business still under the devices node under manage. But we're going to take a look at them really quickly through here and see that we already have a corporate profile in here for Autopilot. And we can look and see that we have a handful of settings that we can administer. So again, what Autopilot is designed to do is to intercept this at the point of Azure AD domain join during the out-of-box experience wizard on a machine. So we have the ability to do customizations of what that out-of-box experience looks like for a user who's using a corporate registered device through Autopilot. So at this point in time, there are a handful of settings, obviously, that are available for this. But as this functionality is expanded out in usage, those features will also be expanded, and we can begin to do additional things. So one of the common requests already that's been discussed is the ability to deliver something like a provisioning package during the out-of-box experience wizard. Currently, for a provisioning package, and we'll take a look at some of the details of those here in a minute. But one of the ways that you can apply a provisioning package is by putting it on a USB key and having that USB key entered during the out-of-box experience phase of Windows setup. So if we can do that using a USB key, will there be an opportunity to deliver that same functionality using Autopilot, since we're essentially in the same point of the process? So you can see where the options can be rapidly expanded for customizing this machine during that initial phase of setup for a user when that machine has been direct shipped to them from the manufacturer or from the vendor. One of the new features that's also being made available is the ability to say, okay, we're going to send this machine to a user. They're going to log in with their Azure Active Directory account, but we don't necessarily want them to be a local administrator on the machine. Maybe we're managing it to the extent that we only want them to be a standard user. So we can actually apply that as part of that Autopilot profile as well. So with those profiles in place, then we can pre-register devices in Autopilot, and then we can actually go through and assign different profiles to those devices. So I may have multiple profiles in here depending on what department or what type of worker it is, or any other reason I may have to differentiate. I can go ahead and assign those devices a particular profile, and then that profile will apply during the out-of-box experience wizard. So go back and look at some of the other options that we have. That's not what I wanted. 1 second. Under device configuration, this is where we can start to determine what actual settings and policies we want enforced on a device once it's enrolled in Intune. So for example, I can have a BitLocker policy that determines what level of encryption I want on the machine and how I want that encryption to play out in terms of different volume types. So you can see there are a number of settings here available for what encryption level I want for the operating system drive versus fixed disks versus removable drives if I want that enabled. And then breaks it down very similar to the group policy settings that you would see in a group policy object for BitLocker. You have those same types of settings in here in terms of what you can manage for BitLocker. And then you can tie that BitLocker encryption status in with conditional access. So you can say, as part of your compliance policy, the device must be encrypted. And if it's not encrypted, I won't allow them access to Exchange Online email, for example. So these policies can be tied in with other Azure-based policies to ensure that there's some integrity and that the data is secure before they're able to access any of those services. So we'll jump back here. So delivering things like a trusted root certificate, or if we have device-based certificate requirements for for different services like VPN or Wi-Fi, being able to deliver a SCEP certificate via NDES to the device, being able to deliver an enterprise key upgrade. So if the device that they received was a Windows 10 Professional, we can do an in-place SKU upgrade of that machine directly to Windows 10 Enterprise on the fly, delivering automatic email profiles. If we go into the device restrictions policy, we can see there are a number of different settings that we can apply to the system to manage that system. So everything from setting the default website in Edge to setting the password policy for the device. We can actually set a custom desktop background if we want it to be configured for or branded for our organization. Managing settings around Windows Defender, antivirus, enforcing a network proxy, any number of different settings that we want to manage on the device that we would normally manage in the traditional sense using group policy. These can be managed now through these mobile device management policies in Windows 10. So let's jump over and look at, actually we'll jump out of here and let's go ahead and look really quickly at provisioning packages. So provisioning packages were released as soon as Windows 10 came out, initially with a program in the ADK called the Windows Imaging and Configuration Designer, or WICD. It has since been released as a universal Windows app from the store, just called simply the Windows Configuration Designer. And what this is designed to do is create a provisioning package which makes runtime changes to the Windows installation. For anybody who's worked with Windows deployment for a long time, you would be familiar with an unattend.xml file that you would use to make configuration changes during Windows setup. So doing things like automatic domain join, enabling or disabling certain Windows features and so forth. Basically, the provisioning packages act sort of as a runtime version of an unattend XML file. So being able to reconfigure the machine on the fly rather than having to rerun Windows setup to make those changes effective. So they provide a very simple interface, or wizard interface, if you want to do just basic provisioning. So we'll go in and we'll take a quick look at what some of those options are. So you can do very simple things like machine naming. So if I want to do, standardize a machine name and maybe use the serial number or just use random characters at the end, I can do that. I can actually enter, if I have a multi-activation key or the KMS client key that I want to use, I can add that. I can actually, one of the new features that they've provided is the ability to remove pre-installed software. So this, again, ties in directly with the scenario that we talked about around being able to do a bring your own device or choose your own device scenario and then have it re-provisioned into a corporate device. So I can actually enable this option and have it do what's effectively a system reset on the machine to strip out all the bloatware and the trialware that the OEM may have placed on it. One key aspect of that, though, is that it does not strip out the drivers. So one of the benefits from getting a machine from the manufacturer is that it already has all the manufacturer's drivers installed and you don't have to hunt them down. Whereas if you reimage it from just a plain Windows 10 installation, you may have drivers missing. Well, by using this feature, we actually can we can maintain all of those drivers within the installation and yet remove all of the bloatware and trialware that we want. So you see other options here around being able to set up a wireless network profile. You can add simple applications or add a trusted root cert. And you can also do bulk enrollment in Azure Active Directory. So you can do a traditional domain join through these. You can just specify a local admin account to create, or you can do a bulk enrollment in Azure Active Directory and use it for that purpose as well. Now, in this case, what we're going to look at in a demo here shortly is a case where the Azure Active Directory domain join will be done during the out-of-box experience wizard. So if I go in and I take a look at this particular policy that I've created for the demo, you'll see that the interface here is a little different, and that's because we've switched it over to the advanced mode for the editing. And when we do that, we can see that there are actually a ton of settings that are available under the hood, and it looks very similar to the Systems Image Manager. If you've done work with unattend.xml files or unattended installations. So there's just a tremendous number of device level settings and policies that we can control using these provisioning packages. And in this particular case, the one that I've created simply does a custom computer name. It does the stripping out of the bloatware from the machine. It enables the out-of-box experience wizard. So basically, I'm going to remove all the bloatware and then reinitialize the out-of-box experience wizard so that I can do the Azure AD domain join. And that's basically all that particular package does. So let's switch over real quick to a virtual machine and take a look at what that would look like from the end user perspective. So in this particular case, I already have this machine as a user. I've received it, it's set up. In this case, my quote unquote trialware from the manufacturer is 7-zip. But we can see I'm not a domain join machine here. I've logged in with a local account. And if we go down and take a look here, we can see that the name is just a standard name. And let me back up here. And we can see I'm not connected to anything. I'm not connected to Azure Active Directory, traditional Active Directory, or anything else. The provisioning package that I was looking at a minute ago, I've already generated and sent to this user. So, it could be sent to them on a USB key. It could be literally emailed. In this case, because I haven't included any applications or any significant data in it, it's literally an 8K file. It's very, very small. But it is a runtime file, so all I have to do is double click on that ppkg file, and it will come back. It will come up and say, "Are you sure you trust the person that sent you this file?" And I can actually password protect it if need be, and provide them with a password. But it will tell them right there, based on what's in the file, the types of changes that it's going to make to that machine. So I'll say yes. This is what I want to do, and I'll go ahead and add that. And it's going to initiate that system reset to go ahead and start stripping out that trialware. Now this process does take a little while, because essentially what it's doing in the background is a system reset back to the core Windows 10 install with the drivers, but without the application. So this will take a little bit. Typically it takes about 10 to 15 minutes usually when I test this. So rather than sit and watch this thing spin for a little bit, I'm going to jump over to another virtual machine that we've already prepped for this. Now in this particular case, this is just a plain CD build of Windows 10 Fall Creators Update. So this is booted up for the first time after the initial setup routine is run, and this is the out-of-box experience wizard that we would expect the user to see when they first boot up the machine, or when they've run that provisioning package that has done the system reset. They would also come back up and see this out-of-box experience wizard. So we'll go ahead and we'll walk our way through this wizard and see what that user experience is. And most of it's just what you would expect, picking keyboard layout and so forth. But at some point here, then it goes ahead and detects the fact that it's actually online. And this is important because part of the Windows setup process is dynamic. And when it goes to this out-of-box experience wizard, Microsoft will actually release updates specifically for the out-of-box experience. And if those updates are detected, they will actually come down as part of the setup process before it even gets into Windows. So just prior to the Fall Creators Update, if you'd run this with an earlier Creators Update build, 1703 update build, or Windows 10 build, you would actually get an out-of-box experience update that would come down during this process. So in this case, now that we've gotten to the phase where it asks you to add an account, what you can notice is this is actually already branded with our Netrix login information, and that's because this machine has been pre-registered in Autopilot. So the device ID was already uploaded, or the hardware ID is already uploaded. So it recognizes this as a corporate-owned Netrix device and prompts me to enter my Netrix account instead of just generically entering something like a a Windows Live account or something. So I'll go ahead and provide it my credentials, and it's going to ask me for my password. And then one of the things we'll notice right away is that it's already tied in, as I mentioned earlier, with multi-factor authentication. So because that's enabled, I actually got the prompt on my phone here to approve that login, and now it's going to continue with that process. So now that I've authenticated to it, it's going ahead and it's joining this machine to Azure Active Directory and registering it. And then it's immediately going to enroll it in Intune, and then the policies are going to come down for that system. So here we get, just as we normally would with a profile creation, we're going to get all the fun little animations that tell us that it's setting up our profile, rather than letting us just watch a little spinning dial. So as this goes through, it will again create a profile based on my Azure Active Directory account. So I'm not creating the traditional local account profile tied to an Active Directory account, but rather one that's tied specifically to my Azure Active Directory account. So when I log in, I'm going to use my universal principal name or my email address, however you want to term that format, but it's going to be your username at yourcompany.com or .org or whatever the case may be. So in this case, I've also provisioned a Windows Hello policy for my systems, which require me to set up a Windows Hello PIN code as soon as I start the machine or as soon as I get logged into the machine. So in this case, I need to go ahead and do that. And so if I look here, my PIN requirements are only 4 digits, so I'm in luck there. So I'll create a PIN code and then go ahead and complete the process to get logged into the system. At that point, once I'm logged into the system and my profile is generated, that's when it'll begin to download all of the policies associated with my account in Azure Active Directory or in Intune. So if I go in and I look now at the user portion here, I'll see that if we look, we can see I am logged in as my account now in my organization. It will show me that I am connected to Azure Active Directory, and I can actually pull up the information, and I can actually initiate if I want a synchronization with that. So instead of doing like a GP update that I would do in a traditional management paradigm, in this case, I can simply go and tell it to synchronize policy from Azure Active Directory or from Intune to have those policies come down. So we'll jump away from this really quickly. In fact, let me check on the other one. Okay, yeah, we can see the other one that we ran the provisioning package on is still doing its PC reset. So it's going to be a little bit before that one is up and available. Depending on the hardware, obviously that process could run a lot more quickly, but in a virtual machine with limited resources like this one, it takes a little longer. So we'll let that go for a minute, and we'll check back on policies shortly. But let's just take a quick look at how we move forward from this. So you have different options depending on what your needs are and where you are with this. If you're a new organization that's just starting out, especially a smaller one where you want to really leverage that mobile workforce paradigm, then start with the cloud first. Start with Azure, build everything out in Azure Active Directory and in Intune. Build everything on the cloud and manage it that way. In some cases, you may need to make that transition. You're currently doing everything in the traditional management paradigm, and you want to shift to modern management. You can do a big switch. You can switch everything over at once. If you're looking at, in particular, if you're doing a config manager hybrid implementation and you want to move, over to the Intune only, you can do a big switch transition and switch everything over from your management authority from one to the other and do it all in one big bang. Or you can do it, you can transition things group by group. So you may have some groups where this makes sense in your organization, where other groups, the modern management paradigm still doesn't meet those needs yet. So do it group by group as needed. until you can get everything over. And then, as we mentioned earlier, you have the co-management capability. So identifying particular workloads and moving those over, transitioning them from one side to the other as you go, and eventually, as everything gets transitioned over, then making that final push over into the modern side. So for making that move, there are a few key things that you'll want to look at to get yourself ready. Enterprise Mobility and Security Suite is kind of a must in this case because you are leveraging Azure Active Directory. From a security side, you're going to want to leverage Azure Active Directory premium features. You're going to leverage Intune, obviously, for the management side. And there are a lot of additional features that enterprise mobility and security bring to the table, especially around advanced threat protection, Azure information protection, and things like that. The next is identifying your must-have policies and requirements. So one of the things you'll often hear is group policy has these thousands and thousands of settings that I can manage, and the OMA URI or the MDM channel only has a handful. While that is true, what you have to ask yourself is what of those group policies are you actually using, and can those functionalities or those concerns be addressed on the MDM side? As Microsoft builds up things on that channel, they're really looking to start from a clean slate and implement based on the things that are most critical or most commonly needed, and expand it out from there. Will there ever be complete parity between group policy and the MDM channel? Probably not, because a lot of the group policies that are currently in place are simply setting things that don't apply in a mobile workforce scenario. So really look to see. It's less about am I limiting myself by not potentially being able to use things that are in group policy versus am I limiting myself by things, by their things that I actually need not being available. Leverage the co-management. If you're in a scenario where you're currently in a hybrid situation and you want to move this direction, Microsoft is working very hard to make it increasingly easier to transition from one management platform to another, so that it's and always in these cases it's intended to be non-disruptive for the end user primarily. So even if there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the back end, it should be seamless for the end user. They should never know that they've been transitioned from one management platform to another. Work through creating and provisioning packages. Even in a traditional management scenario, provisioning packages are a very powerful way to be able to reconfigure systems or add settings to systems without having to rely on traditional management platforms and without having to rely on image management to do it. And then test the autopilot features. It's very easy to. Michael Niehaus from Microsoft provided a PowerShell script that you can run on a system and be able to generate these hardware IDs, which can then be uploaded and imported directly into Autopilot. So it's very easy to test out the scenario between a provisioning package and the Autopilot to replicate exactly what I just did in this demo on virtually any machine that you have. So it's a very easy thing to test out. Test it out and see if this scenario is practical and feasible, and if you can manage all of the settings you need to manage for a user that falls into this mobile management paradigm. So let's jump back real quick, just take a look and see. Yeah, our PC is still resetting. So let's jump over here. And I've delivered, so one of the applications that was delivered automatically from Intune was the Citrix receiver, so it's already asking me for that account. And if I look in the notification area, it's going to tell me that I need to encrypt my system with BitLocker. Now in this particular case, this virtual machine, I don't have a virtual TPM in, so BitLocker encryption would fail in this case. But typically the TPM is going to be enabled on these machines, and so the user basically is just able to go ahead and initiate the BitLocker encryption in the background and continue with their work. And if we look, we should probably see, we see the Citrix receiver there. And then over time, you can see other applications are going to come down. So the Office 365 click to run is going to come down and so forth. So with that ends the portion of discussion around or presentation around modern management and the cloud managed desktop. So at this point, we'll pause real quick and see what questions we have. So if you do have questions, just go ahead and type them in the chat window, and we'll go ahead and address those. So Mike has a question of why wouldn't the full set of group policies be available on a Windows machine connected to an Azure Active Directory? So I guess I'm not entirely sure what the question is. If it's group policy, traditional group policy versus the MDM channel, it's managing through a completely separate management channel. So group policies, essentially all group policies are, for the most part, is just an interface for setting registry keys for the most part. And it's managed through the built-in group policy agent on the workstation. In the case of the mobile device management channel, it's just leveraging OMA URI and managing the settings through a different provider or a different agent, if you will, on the machine. It's functionally the end is the same. It's just a question of which settings are being imported or added into that particular management channel. Do we have any other questions? Actually, at this point, I'll go ahead, and if anybody wants to just go ahead and unmute, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask the question. It might be a little easier. So give a second. I see somebody's typing here, so. But again, in terms of being able to test this out, it does definitely apply to a specific scenario that's been a thorn in the side of systems management folks for a long time. As I've spent almost 20 years in desktop administration, and these were always the scenarios that we hated the most, because we would have we would have these mobile sales force folks or something, and a lot of times we would just end up giving them a laptop. They were local admins on the machine. We never could really manage them. We never knew what was going to happen with them. And so, and then anytime anything was wrong with them, they'd have to bring them in and to a depot, or we'd have to ship another one out to swap it. But they were very, very difficult to manage. And even as more and more internet-based management capabilities came into things like Config Manager, and even with the advent of direct access, while it became easier, there was still so much reliance on having to have that internal infrastructure set up and configured properly, and ultimately having to facilitate them connecting back into that local infrastructure. So now with a more modern management approach, we can leverage cloud services and ensure that as long as they have an internet connection, they're being managed no matter where they are. It also then makes the device itself is less of a constraint. So the ability to take almost any device and reconfigure it, or at least secure it at a minimal level to the extent that they can use it to access their corporate resources, makes it much easier for users to do their job, really. And it's become very analogous to mobile devices and phones. I mean, how it's very rare that anymore that IT workers or anybody really has a phone for more than 2 or 3 years. And quite often, you face a scenario where your phone is lost, your phone is stolen. You drop it in the pool, or drop it on the concrete, and the device itself becomes unusable. You can very quickly go out and get a new phone, the same model, even different model, and within a very short period of time, you're back up and running. And not only do you have a working phone, but all of your contacts are there, all of your applications are back down, all of your photos and everything else are still available, and that's all been facilitated by the use of cloud services and essentially a cloud-based management. So this is simply extending that same paradigm that all of our end users are used to into the enterprise computing arena, to ensure that same type of usability and mobility. Do we have any more questions? Any comments or questions around the mobile or the modern management scenario? All right, with that, we'll go ahead and end today's presentation. I appreciate everybody taking the time. Hopefully you got some useful information. We will be making this recording available for others after the fact, so look for that link to come out, and have an excellent weekend, everyone. Thank you.